Wilson. Gaddis's scant references to Wilson focus on his interventions in Mexico and the Caribbean in alleged defense against Germany. Whatever one thinks of the validity of the pretexts, Wilson's shocking crimes in the course of those interventions, particularly in Haiti, are a curious, though conventional, illustration of his lofty idealism. The Adams example, Gaddis's centerpiece, is much more relevant to his main thesis on the roots of current doctrine, a realistic thesis, I believe, with significant implications for both understanding the past and considering what lies ahead. As Secretary of State under President James Monroe, Adams established the lofty idealistic tradition in his justifications for General Andrew Jackson's conquest of Spanish-held Florida in the First Seminole War of 1818. The war was justified in self-defense, Adams argued. Gaddis concurs that the conquest was driven by legitimate security concerns. In his version, after Britain sacked Washington in 1814, Adams recognized that the country was in danger and adopted the principle that has always defined U.S. strategic thinking. Expansion, we have assumed, is the path to security. On this invariant American principle, the United States conquered Florida, and the doctrine has now been extended to the whole world by Bush. Gaddis concludes, plausibly, that when Bush warned that Americans must be ready for preemptive action when necessary to defend our liberty and to defend our lives, he was echoing an old tradition rather than establishing a new one, reiterating principles that presidents from Adams to Woodrow Wilson would all have understood very well. All of Bush's predecessors, Gaddis explains, recognized that U.S. security was threatened by failed states, dangerous power vacuums that the United States should fill to guarantee its own security, from Florida in 1818 to Iraq in 2003. Gaddis cites the right scholarly sources, primarily historian William Earl Weeks, but omits what they say. We learn a lot about the precedents for current doctrines and the current consensus by examining the omitted information. Weeks describes in lurid detail what Jackson was doing in the exhibition of murder and plunder known as the First Seminole War, which was just another phase in his project of removing or eliminating Native Americans from the Southeast, underway long before the sacking of Washington in 1814, in a war declared by the United States. Far from inspiring Adams' grand strategy, the sacking of Washington was apparently of little concern to him, even while he was negotiating the peace treaty that ended the war. Florida was a problem both because it had not yet been incorporated into the expanding American empire, in the terminology of the Founding Fathers, and because it was a haven for Indians and runaway slaves, fleeing either the wrath of Jackson or slavery. There was an Indian attack, which Jackson and Adams used as a pretext. After U.S. forces had driven a band of Seminoles off their lands, killing several and burning their village to the ground, members of the tribe retaliated by attacking a supply boat under military command. Seizing the opportunity, Jackson embarked on a campaign of terror, devastation, and intimidation, destroying villages and sources of food in a calculated effort to inflict starvation on the tribes. So matters continued, leading to Adams' endorsement of Jackson's attempt to establish in Florida the dominion of this republic upon the odious basis of violence and bloodshed. These words of the Spanish ambassador are a painfully precise description of Adams' stand, Weeks writes. Adams had consciously distorted, dissembled, and lied about the goals and conduct of American foreign policy to both Congress and the public, grossly violating his proclaimed moral principles, implicitly defending Indian removal, slavery, and the use of military force without congressional approval. The crimes of Jackson and Adams proved but a prelude to a second war of extermination against the Seminoles, in which the remnants either fled westward to suffer the same fate later, or were killed or forced to take refuge in the dense swamps of Florida. Today, Weeks observes, the Seminoles survive in the national consciousness as the mascot of Florida State University, an example that is all too familiar and a painfully precise reflection of how we make use of our freedom, while condemning with derision those who refuse to face up to their own sordid past. Adams recognized the absurdity of his justifications, Weeks explains, but felt that, in Adams' own words, it was better to err on the side of vigor than on the side of weakness, to speak in ways clearer than truth, as Dean Acheson was later to express the sentiment. The account Adams gave, Weeks writes, stands as a monumental distortion of the causes and conduct of Jackson's conquest of Florida, reminding historians not to search for truth in official explanations of events. Sound advice to the present. Elsewhere, Weeks notes that Adams' distortions were publicly revealed in the report of a special Senate committee charged with investigating the Seminole War, which concluded that Jackson had inflicted a wound on the national character with the support of Adams, who alone persuaded Monroe to endorse Jackson's crimes. But few Americans took much notice of these criticisms, Weeks notes. Adams' bold defense of Jackson had shifted the focus from international law and constitutional scruple to a sacred narrative of American right versus Spanish, Indian, and British wrong. Weeks stresses the important point that by endorsing Jackson's crimes, Adams transferred the power to make war from Congress to the executive branch in violation of the Constitution. He was isolated in taking that stand. The editor of Adams' papers writes that President Monroe and all the members of his cabinet, except Adams, were of the opinion that Jackson had acted not only without, but against his instructions, that he had committed war upon Spain, which cannot be justified, and which, if not disavowed by the administration, they will be abandoned by the country, a prediction that was quickly refuted. Near the end of his life, Adams bitterly condemned this usurpation of the congressional power to make war. In an 1847 letter to another sharp critic of the Mexican War, he denounced President Polk's war message as a direct and notorious violation of the truth, lamenting that it is now established as an irreversible precedent that the President of the United States has but to declare that war exists, and the war is essentially declared. Adams finally recognized the danger to liberty and republicanism implied by his shredding of the Constitution, but seems not to have acknowledged his part in establishing the precedent, Weeks comments. The principle remains in force, not troubling the originalists who pride themselves on their strict adherence to the intentions of the framers. The principle continues to undermine liberty and democracy, not to speak of the fate of the victims of executive wars. Weeks points out that Adams also established the presidential rhetoric of empire, designed to marshal public as well as congressional support for its policies. The rhetorical framework, a durable and essential aspect of American diplomacy, inherited and elaborated by successive generations of American statesmen, but fundamentally unchanged over time, rests on three pillars: the assumption of the unique moral virtue of the United States, the assertion of its mission to redeem the world by spreading its professed ideals and the American way of life, and always the faith in the nation's divinely ordained destiny. The theological framework reduces policy issues to a choice between good and evil, thus undercutting reasoned debate and fending off the threat of democracy. The issue of defense against Britain, the only credible enemy, more accurately deterrent, did not arise. British Minister Castlereagh was so eager to cement Anglo-American relations that he even overlooked Jackson's murder of 2 innocent British citizens, which Adams defended for its salutary efficacy for terror and example. Adams was heeding the words of Tacitus, his favorite historian, Weeks suggests that crime